never will know that how my mother really when she died.
I've known about the concentration camps as long as I can remember. But I can honestly say I never used to think about it too much.
At first you just hear it, it's just a story, and it's not real. But then one day you realize that, hey, this really happened, and it was really my mother.
Yes. I love them. I love them both.
My mother wasn't in a Holocaust.
To the camp. Immediately they took him to the gas chamber. When my children cried because they got hurt or because they didn't get what they wanted, I didn't hear or see my children. I saw them burn. Guilty that I had put a load on you because of my experiences.
Well, you did. You did. You put a load on me.
It's obvious that it has something to do with who I am. I don't know to what extent it does.
I think I owe all my children an apology.
It's the guilt and your imagination, your fantasy about what might have happened and what might have happened to you. Totally different Holocaust, Jack. What you're talking about is the Holocaust of the mind.
This is Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Jewish Culture and Holocaust, and October 7th in the Stand Against Hate International Communities. Thanks for joining us for A Generation Apart, What We Carry, a documentary film focusing on intergenerational survivor, second and third generation survivor trauma, PSTD issues, and the science of epigenetics. Over the last 4 years, my professional mental health colleagues have produced several Zoom programs on this topic. Please know that I am not a mental health professional, and I have disclosed many times that I have suffered from Holocaust survivor trauma without knowing or understanding it my entire life. Over the last 3 years, I have presented a series of Zoom programs entitled Into the Light on Intergenerational Survivor Trauma. These programs are so popular with on-demand viewers that the content has helped thousands realize their need for healing. And now, through the art of filmmaking, this medium provides a unique opportunity to create a lasting, critical documentary of work that becomes increasingly important as we lose our survivor community. Intergenerational survivor trauma is now scientifically proven to be linked to the study of epigenetic science. Several words of caution. This film is not intended or is considered a mental health therapy. Jeffrey Geisner and the film are not associated with any medical or mental health organization. The material in the documentary film, A Generation Apart, What We Carry, should not be seen by ages 13 and younger. Also, the subject matter, photos, video, recordings, music, pictures, and content of the documentary could be disturbing to some who suffer, like I do, from intergenerational survivor trauma or PTSD disorders. As a second-generation survivor, I am very cautious about selecting the content for all my films. The photos and video images are not something you have not seen before. However, the discussions may allow you to, for the first time, realize you are not alone. And there are mental health professionals in this specific field who are willing to help you personally. You can also reach me by email or Facebook Messenger. I would be happy to share tools and a toolbox of helpful aids, guidance, and research references that can move your journey of discovery and exploration along. A Generation Apart, What We Carry is free and available on demand. Please share the film widely with family and friends and on your social networks. I also created this film as an educational tool for all audiences, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave me a comment with your takeaways from the film. The film is shared in 2 parts. Please return to YouTube Media for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust October 7th Remembrance to watch both parts of A Generation Apart, What We Carry.
"59-year-old Karen Sonnenberg grew up on the North Shore of Long Island, just an hour's drive from New York City. Her parents survived the Holocaust, but rarely mentioned it.
All I knew was that we were different, that I was different. I didn't exactly know why.
Her parents were Jewish, born in Germany, but after Hitler came to power, their families fled. Sonnenberg's parents were just children, but carried the traumas of Nazi oppression throughout their lives.
My mother, from the time she was 3 on, from my father, from the time he was 5 or 6 years old, he was subjected to the painful existence in Germany.
Despite her own comfortable upbringing here in the U.S., Sonneberg privately struggled for years with anxiety and stress. And while she couldn't prove it, she believed it was somehow linked to her parents' traumatic childhoods.
Having discussed this with many of my friends who come from similar backgrounds, it seems to be consistent in most of us. There were definitely challenges that, quote-unquote, American kids didn't seem to have experienced.
Even though you weren't there.
Exactly. That's the amazing part of it.
Now, a new study published this month in the scientific journal Biological Psychiatry bolsters Sonneberg's belief that she experienced the after effects of her parents' trauma. Dr. Rachel Yehuda, director of Mount Sinai's Traumatic Stress Studies Division, led the study. Her team interviewed and drew blood from 32 sets of survivors and their children, focusing on a gene called FKBP5.
We already know that this is a gene that contributes to risk for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yehuda noticed a pattern among the Holocaust survivors called an epigenetic change. Not a change in the gene itself, but rather a change in a chemical marker attached to it.
And when we looked at their own children, their children also had an epigenetic change in the same spot on a stress-related gene.
What does that suggest?
Well, in the first generation, in the Holocaust survivor, it suggests that there has been an adaptation or a response to a horrendous environmental event. And in the second generation, it suggests that there has also been a response of the offspring to this parental trauma.
Which means children of Holocaust survivors like Sonneberg could be more likely to develop stress or anxiety disorders. Though their study was small, Yehuda and her team controlled for any early trauma the survivors' children may have experienced themselves. How is it that a parent who was subjected to the trauma of the Holocaust is able to somehow transmit that to a child who wasn't there?
Oh, that's a really good question. And this study that we did doesn't address the how. The study that we did just provides a proof of concept that we might be able to identify the how if we do more research.
DNA is passed from parents to children, but research like Yehuda's suggests parental life experiences can modify their body chemistry, and those modifications can be transmitted to children as well. Scientists have examined this idea before. After a famine in Holland during 1944 and 45, children were born with the effects of malnutrition 2 generations after the food shortage ended. Previously, Yehuda herself studied stress hormone levels in children born to women who survived the September 11th terrorist attacks. She's been examining the link between trauma experienced by Holocaust survivors and their children for more than 20 years.
A trauma is an event that changes you, and it doesn't have to change you for the negative. Trauma changes you in lots of different ways, but most people who experience extreme trauma learn a great deal from that experience. And some of those lessons may be lessons that are transmitted to the child, and that's not a bad thing.
Yehuda says the implications aren't limited to Holocaust survivors, but this dwindling population provides insight into how clinicians understand and treat stress disorders.
If you're at risk for heart disease, a lot of times a doctor can separate out, well, this is your weight, that's not good, this is your diet, these are your genetic risks, and things like that. And it would be very nice if we could develop a similar risk profile in the mental health arena, where we would be able to understand where the risk factors come from for depression and anxiety.
We're on the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. There were children who were born after that trauma. There are children born in the trauma of a war in Syria and other crises around the world. If you're the child of a parent who experienced trauma, are you doomed to be depressed or stressed for the rest of your life?
I don't think you're doomed, but I think that many children of traumatized parents have struggled with depression and anxiety, and I can tell you that many of them have felt relieved that there might be a contributing factor that has been based on how they're responding to their parental trauma. I think that it's helped people work through a lot of that depression and anxiety.
Relief is exactly what Karen Sonnenberg, the child of Holocaust survivors, felt after she participated in one of Dr. Yehuda's trauma survivor studies. She lost her mother 30 years ago, but looks forward to her father's 90th birthday next year.
I've learned to cope in my life. I've learned to move on and get over all of this. Had I known at the time how my reactions could impact future children, my children's reactions, I might have dealt with things differently, or gotten them some sort of treatment that maybe would help them in the future.
In today's conversation, I thought that it would be beneficial to have a clear definition of what intergenerational trauma is, and your work as a clinical psychologist and professor, and how this focuses on the specific type of trauma in your professional career.
Define intergenerational trauma. There's a few
today's conversation. I thought that it would be beneficial to have a clear definition of what intergenerational trauma is, and your work as a clinical psychologist and professor, and how this focuses on the specific type of trauma in your professional career.
Define intergenerational trauma. There's a few terms that are fairly nuanced but similar in how they're talked about in research and in clinical work, and that includes intergenerational trauma, secondary traumatization, vicarious trauma, collective trauma, cultural trauma, historical trauma. And while some of these are fairly nuanced, the terms really address the broad idea that the adverse consequences of traumatic experiences are not limited to the individuals who are directly exposed to the traumas, or traumatic event. And so that the effects can impact others in the environment. So whether that be maybe family members, maybe children, descendants, maybe their friends or caregivers, individuals from the same cultural group. So this idea that the consequences and resiliencies, which we'll talk a little bit about, of trauma are not just limited to those who were directly exposed. And in fact, there has been a lot of recent research on this idea of indirectly experiencing a trauma can actually have very similar effects to those who have been directly exposed to the traumatic event. So again, all of those terms kind of broadly address that idea that we don't necessarily need direct exposure to a traumatic event, or even events to experience the challenges and consequences of that trauma.
There's no getting around the fact that bad things happen to people, things that are often outside of their control. And the psychological effects of wars, natural disasters, and other types of violence and accidents don't just go away when the war ends. They can leave people traumatized. Many people who are exposed to traumas like war get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, where thoughts or anxieties about the events can plague them in other parts of their lives, and seemingly benign things can trigger a fear response. But hopefully, once a war goes down in history and a few generations pass, we'll be free of the trauma, right? Unfortunately, it's not so simple. Trauma can affect future generations too. For example, in a study of 100 Holocaust survivors, researchers found that their children were more likely to get a PTSD diagnosis, even though they didn't report any more traumatic experience in their lives than a similar control group did. What they did get was stories from their parents, really distressing stories. And hearing about threats to your family, even in the past, can be traumatic on its own. But that might not be the only explanation. Trauma could also be inherited biologically, sort of like what gets passed on through our genes. And since a big part of understanding people is knowing about the different factors that can affect their thought processes and behaviors, psychologists want to figure out how this works. So far, we do have some evidence that trauma can be passed biologically from one generation to the next. A lot of it comes from a study published in 2015, where researchers did some genetic tests on a sample of 32 Holocaust survivors, 22 of their children, as well as a demographically similar control group. They were looking at what's known as methylation of the genes, where a DNA molecule gets a sort of hop-on called a methyl group. If a gene has a lot of methyl groups attached to it, they can create problems with copying that gene, or it can keep the gene from doing what it's supposed to do. Studying methylation is part of the field of epigenetics, the study of what can be inherited or passed on from parent to child biologically, but but outside of the actual letters of your DNA. Since methylation levels can change based on your environment, it's a way things that happen in your life can affect what you pass down. And the researchers found that compared to the control groups, both the Holocaust survivors and their children had higher methylation levels in a gene related to stress response. Previous research showed that gene was related to an increased risk in developing a psychological disorder like PTSD in people who experienced some kind of trauma in their childhood. So the team thought they might have found a biological way for trauma to be inherited through increased methylation that gets passed on.
Could you discuss briefly the theory of epigenetics and the idea of how one's environment can affect genetic expression within second and third generation Holocaust survivors?
Sure. So in 2016, there was work that was conducted by Yehuda and colleagues. And the research on this is fairly a mixed bag, but that study in particular found that both Holocaust survivors and their offspring have methylation changes in the FKBP gene, and that gene has been identified as having a role in PTSD, in stress, in depression, and anxiety, and that stress-related gene has been associated with some of those difficulties, right? PTSD, depression, anxiety. And so researchers examined blood samples of 32 Holocaust survivors and 22 of their adult children. And so they compared it to a control group of the methylation of this specific gene. And so that study concluded and suggests that Holocaust trauma may shift the biology of descendants. And so the observations of that change in both parent and child, so the Holocaust survivor and their adult child, suggest that the children of traumatized parents, are not maybe born with this sort of methylation change, the genetic change, and so they may inherit traits that might make them a little bit more susceptible, but also, again, speaking to that resiliency point. Wanting to make space for both the potential vulnerabilities of those experiences and being a descendant of a survivor of genocide or a Holocaust survivor, but also wanting to make space. And in the conclusions of this study, they also talk about wanting to make space for the resilience. And so the post-traumatic growth, the strength-based pieces as well. And so oftentimes when we're talking about this idea of intergenerational trauma, we can hold space for the challenges and the consequences, but also holding space for possibly the post-traumatic growth and the resiliencies that might emerge out of that.
Here's a conundrum. Identical twins originate from the same DNA, so how can they turn out so different, even in traits that have a significant genetic component? For instance, why might one twin get heart disease at 55 while her sister runs marathons in perfect health? Nature versus nurture has a lot to do with it, but a deeper related answer can be found within something called epigenetics. That's the study of how DNA interacts with the multitude of smaller molecules found within cells, which can activate and deactivate genes. If you think of DNA as a recipe book, those molecules are largely what determine what gets cooked when. They aren't making any conscious choices themselves. Rather, their presence and concentration within cells makes the difference. So how does that work? Genes in DNA are expressed when they're read and transcribed into RNA, which is translated into proteins by structures called ribosomes. And proteins are much of what determines a cell's characteristics and function. Epigenetic changes can boost or interfere with the transcription of specific genes. The most common way interference happens is that DNA, or the proteins it's wrapped around, gets labeled with small chemical tags. The set of all of the chemical tags that are attached to the genome of a given cell is called the epigenome. Some of these, like a methyl group, inhibit gene expression by derailing the cellular transcription machinery or causing the DNA to coil more tightly, making it inaccessible. The gene is still there, but it's silent. Boosting transcription is essentially the opposite. Some chemical tags will unwind the DNA, making it easier to transcribe. which ramps up production of the associated protein. Epigenetic changes can survive cell division, which means that they could affect an organism for its entire life. Sometimes that's a good thing. Epigenetic changes are part of normal development. The cells in an embryo start with one master genome. As the cells divide, some genes are activated and others inhibited. Over time, through this epigenetic reprogramming, some cells develop into heart cells and others into liver cells. Each of the approximately 200 cell types in your body has essentially the same genome, but its own distinct epigenome. The epigenome also mediates a lifelong dialogue between genes and the environment. The chemical tags that turn genes on and off can be influenced by factors including diet, chemical exposure, and medication. The resulting epigenetic changes can eventually lead to disease if, for example, they turn off a gene that makes a tumor-suppressing protein. Environmentally induced epigenetic changes are part of the reason why genetically identical twins can grow up to have very different lives. As twins get older, their epigenomes diverge, affecting the way they age and their susceptibility to disease. Even social experiences can cause epigenetic changes. In one famous experiment, when mother rats weren't attentive enough to their pups, genes in the babies that help them manage stress were methylated and turned off. And it might not stop with that generation. Most epigenetic marks are erased when egg and sperm cells are formed. But now, researchers think that some of those imprints survive, passing those epigenetic traits on to the next generation. Your mother's or your father's experiences as a child or choices as adults could actually shape your own epigenome. But even though epigenetic changes are sticky, they're not necessarily permanent. A balanced lifestyle that includes a healthy diet, exercise, and avoiding exposure to contaminants may, in the long run, create a healthy epigenome. It's an exciting time to be studying this. Scientists are just beginning to understand how epigenetics could explain mechanisms of human development and aging, as well as the origins of cancer, heart disease, mental illness, addiction, and many other conditions. Meanwhile, new genome editing techniques are making it much easier to identify which epigenetic changes really matter for health and disease. Once we understand how our epigenome influences us, we might be able to influence it too.
To that note, I would ask you, how does intergenerational trauma affect familial relationships? And how can people dealing with intergenerational trauma, especially people who are raising or thinking about raising the next generation, be proactive about minimizing intergenerational trauma for their own children?
And that's such a great question. And particularly the familial relationships piece is such a key part of the research and has been studied in not just Holocaust survivors, has been studied in a variety of different groups and populations and cultural groups that have experienced this historical intergenerational trauma that we've been talking about. And so that familial relationships piece is what prompted me in my experiences being the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, prompted me to really want to focus on that variable in my research. And so I looked specifically at family factors. So I looked at family communication, I looked at family functioning, and how that relates to the expression of psychological symptoms in second and third generation Holocaust survivors. And so within my research, I found that descendants who reported less adaptive family communication or less adaptive emotional expression within their family actually endorsed higher levels of symptoms. And most specifically, symptoms of withdrawal and isolation. And so we also found similarly that descendants who were reporting less family cohesion, so feeling less cohesive within their family unit and lower family levels of family functioning, also reported significantly more symptoms related to anxiety and withdrawal and isolation. So what we want to take away from that is, so what can we do, to speak to your question, what can we do within the family unit, boosting and bolstering family resilience factors to promote family level resilience. And so when we talk about what is adaptive family functioning, healthy family functioning, when we're talking about those terms, we're speaking most directly to communicating emotions, maybe feeling heard by our family members when we're expressing emotions. Oftentimes it can be useful to have a shared emotional language within the family, speaking about emotions freely in helpful and useful ways, right? Using non-blaming language, using things that we talk about in pop psychology, like I statements and validating and making sure we all feel heard. That also relates to ideas of family cohesion and family functioning. As families, do we collaboratively problem solve? Do we feel accepted within the family unit for who we are? Do we trust and turn to one another to support each other in times of crisis? Do we openly discuss our fears and concerns as a family unit? Those are all what we call family resilience factors. And so what the research, not just my research with Holocaust survivors, but family resiliency research with other populations as well, shows that family resilience factors are huge and key. So we really need family level interventions to boost those skills and factors, more as a kind of preventative prevention model. And that can be a really useful piece, boosting those resiliency factors, communication, emotional expression, family cohesion, family problem solving. Those are all things that we know are really useful and adaptive and helpful within the family context.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so instructive. I'm also a grandchild of survivors, and this gives me much wisdom as well. Moving on to the next question. What are the layers of trauma that second and third generation survivors experience? And does the intensity of those layers diminish with each subsequent generation? In other words, does intergenerational trauma always follow a linear path from first generation to second generation to third generation? Or does it present differently in different family dynamics? Of the concept of fear of continued oppression, what are the channels available to express feelings of intergenerational trauma in positive and constructive ways?
Yep. That's an excellent question. And I think that can look different for everyone. There's not necessarily a one size fits all, but when we think about things that support meaning making and connection are generally, for many, positive ways, right, to connect with that. So perhaps maybe, joining a support group of like-minded individuals, or maybe individuals who have experienced and can connect with these constructs of intergenerational trauma, collective and cultural trauma. Perhaps more solitary ways of journaling, writing, reflection, expressive arts, activism, social justice. And in addition to that, when we think about meaning making in general, right, research has shown the powerful effects of storytelling and narrative as a way that we can make meaning. And Viktor Frankl has done a lot of work in his logotherapy about meaning making, narrative therapy. How do we make meaning out of trauma? And so the powerful effects of storytelling can be really, really important, and can be a great way to connect with that in a constructive way, in a way that we can make meaning in a more positive way. And so those are just some examples of how we might be able to do that.
Right, exactly. And when we think about how we construct narrative and how we create meaning, what is the relationship between second and third generation survivors to visual and oral history of the Holocaust? Is there a heightened sense of moral obligation to preserve memory by the direct descendants of the Holocaust versus within the general population?
Yeah, I think that, and this emerged in my qualitative interviews as well, and I know have emerged in other qualitative research around being the descendant of a Holocaust survivor. And I would argue, maybe even as a Jew in general, this idea of never forget, our duty to remember, is something that's often explained in the relationship to the Holocaust. And that the Jewish people must never forget and never let similar atrocities occur again. And that's something that seems to reverberate across generations and may manifest in different ways. As my personal experience, there has been this, I've taken on the role of family historian and taken it even a step further by conducting my dissertation on this as a means to make meaning for myself. And so, I have so many books that talk about the experiences of the Holocaust and World War II, and I can speak to my father's experience as well, this almost borderline obsession with wanting to know more as much as we can, continue to think about these things. And so as we think about this idea and this notion of never forgetting, that might look totally different, right? Again, there's no one size fits all model for being a descendant or, being the child, grandchild, now great grandchild of Holocaust survivors. And so we likely connect to that part of our identity in a variety of different ways. And so a good place to start is to really ask yourself, how do I even connect with this part of my identity? How salient does this part of my identity feel? Feel? And I mean, I'd love to ask that question to you, Lisa, of like, you know, how do you connect with this part of your identity, being the descendant of a survivor?
That's a great question. To me, being a third generation survivor is something that I almost feel on a molecular level. It's part and parcel of the fabric of my being. And it really is what drives my sense of activism, my sense of responsibility, my desire to preserve memory, not just for myself, but for subsequent generations. I would say that as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, the phrase "a genocide denied is a genocide continued" is particularly meaningful for me. And for this reason, I would say President Biden's recent public recognition of the Armenian genocide particularly resonated with me as a moment of tremendous catharsis and kinship with descendants of the Armenian genocide. You know, it's being a descendant of a survivor is something that connects me to other descendants of other genocides and atrocities.
Yeah. And I think that that's a way that we can make meaning, right? Those connections, that feeling of connectedness can be so important and can even relate to our desires, our intentions to engage in advocacy efforts, to engage in social justice efforts. And that's a way that we make meaning as well. And so, you know, a salient aspect for meaning making for some may be, you know, as a community member, as a group, feeling that sense of interconnectedness, you know, with humanity, with other groups who may have experienced similar things. So, you know, I think that feeling of resonating with that and having that statement be important to you and feel connected to you, I imagine that you're not alone in that feeling.
Exactly. And at this point, I would probably mention a project that both you and I participated in recently, a documentary project called If You Heard What I Heard. And would you like to explain a little bit about this project?
Sure. So as a part of this project, both Lisa and I were interviewed about our grandparents' experiences during the Holocaust. And so to speak to, again, that powerful component of storytelling and narrative, I'd love to ask you, Lisa, how you connected with it. But for me, it was extremely therapeutic and powerful to tell my grandmother's story. And to recount that felt so empowering, and to speak to all that she has been through, but to speak also to the resiliencies that she passed down to my father and to me and to you know, my cousins, is something that I deeply resonate with. And so I'd love to even ask you, Lisa, too, like, what was your experience to be able to tell and recount your grandmother's narrative?
You know, when I first embarked on this project, I was very apprehensive because my grandmother, who just passed several months ago, was very reserved about describing her experiences during the war. And so I would say as I grew older, when I started to approach her about her experience in the Holocaust, she started to open up to me very slowly, but it was definitely not a part of my childhood experience. We knew that she was a survivor. We knew that she was the sole survivor of her entire family. But as I grew older, I started to become much more inquisitive and I would say connected to my grandmother's past in a very powerful way. And giving this interview for me was an important opportunity to really reflect on the span of my grandmother's lifetime, from her early childhood before the war to her Holocaust years in Auschwitz, and after the war, subsequently her move to the United States. It was very empowering because it gave me a sense of how incredibly resilient she was to have lost her entire family at age 13 and to be faced with navigating an entire world by herself, and then ultimately moving to a different country, learning a new language, learning a new trade, all on her own with my grandfather. It's something that almost puts into perspective what we consider to be our challenges in our lifetime.
Yeah, and that's something that, you mentioned that sometimes survivors may not have openly shared their experiences. And what we know from the research, and Daniele speaks of the conspiracy of silence with second generation survivors. First, the survivors themselves oftentimes didn't necessarily openly share their experiences with their children. And we can assume maybe what some of those reasons might be. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe, there was some compartmentalizing of this new life. And, maybe it felt like too close of a relationship, didn't want to sort of share those experiences with their children. And so that was communicated silence. But then the second generation didn't necessarily want to inquire to their parents' experience for fear of re-traumatizing them. So we have with the second generation what was sometimes seen as this cycle of silence, right? First generation didn't share their experiences with their children. Children, for fear of re-traumatizing, didn't inquire. Now that conspiracy of silence does not seem to translate to third generation survivors. And we see a different relationship with the trauma, with Holocaust trauma, with being a descendant of survivors, with the third generation. And so what research does show is there's a different type of identification that third generation survivors have with their grandparents' experience. And so oftentimes, and this showed up in my qualitative research as well, third generation openly inquired to their grandparents about their experiences, and survivors oftentimes share that willingly and openly with the third generation. And so what do we make of that, right? Maybe it was an amount of time that lapsed. Maybe there was a once removed generation that felt safer. Maybe, we can sort of make assumptions, and we don't know, right? We'll likely not know. But we can assume as to why there was that conspiracy of silence that often showed up with second generation survivors, and how the line of communication seemed to open up a little bit more in a different way with third generation survivors.
Absolutely. And to that point, I would say that when I was in my early 20s, I chose to learn Yiddish, my grandmother's native tongue, in Israel on a fellowship program. And when I came back to Los Angeles, being able to communicate with my grandmother in her native tongue added a whole other dimension to our relationship, and for her ability to communicate with me, to communicate ideas and facets of her life that otherwise she may have lacked the vocabulary to fully express, or now she clearly understood that my interest was so strongly connected to her past. So that was definitely something that that I experienced as a third generation survivor.
I love that. And I think that speaks to that connectivity and that meaning making in and of itself. And I must admit that's something I've looked into as well. And after my grandmother died in 2018, I looked into starting Yiddish classes as a way to feel more connected and closer to her after her death. So I almost have a sense of jealousy that you did that. And now it makes me want to do it even more. I feel like after this webinar, I'm going to go look for Yiddish classes again to enroll.
You know, it's interesting because Yiddish is experiencing a tremendous revival amongst people of third generation age and even younger than us. It's fascinating. Moving on to the next question, what broader impacts can intergenerational trauma have on a community or a society? And how can the descendants of survivors preserve the legacy of the victims of the Holocaust without necessarily carrying forth the heavy emotional weight of previous generations? And is that even possible?
It's an excellent question. And I want to speak to a little bit about this idea of emotional weight. And I would say sort of as a society, we kind of label and judge what emotional weight looks like. And the reality is it's not necessarily a bad, and I don't like using dichotomous terms like bad and good, but emotional weight isn't necessarily a bad or a negative thing, right? And it's a normal part of the human experience. We have experiences that carry emotional weight. We have experiences that bring about distress, that bring about discomfort. And so oftentimes when we're labeling things, as bad or emotional weight, while things might carry emotional weight, they may also simultaneously hold resilience and post-traumatic growth. So holding space for both of those things is oftentimes a good place to start, right? And as the descendant of a survivor, holding space for, the atrocities that were committed and holding space for the traumas that we're experiencing and experienced in the survival, but also holding space for the resilience and the post-traumatic growth, and holding space for both of those things can often be empowering and a useful place to start. So as we talk about the broader impacts, and there has been research that has been done, not just in Holocaust families, but in other cultural groups around collective, cultural, communal trauma. And most recently, there's been a lot of research and burgeoning research around, re-traumatization, that events and or racial stress and trauma or discrimination, and the impact that those things can have on collective and cultural trauma. I want to also speak to, a little bit about what my research displayed. And I spoke a little bit about it earlier with this withdrawal and isolation symptom that was correlated with family communication and family functioning. But what the qualitative data actually backed up was this deep sense of differentness or interpersonal alienation amongst both second and third generation survivors. So feeling different as a direct result of their parents' or grandparents' experience. So that feeling of differentness, navigating the world as different, was something that came up as significant in the project. But what also emerged, and again, to hold that space with, the emotional weight with resilience, there was also a deep feeling that they were resilient as a direct result, like you mentioned, as a direct result of their parents' or grandparents' experience. And one of the participants of the study mentioned that she refers to this as Holocaust strength. And I really resonated with that term and even kind of integrated it into my own vocabulary, this sense of Holocaust strength. And in experiences of adversity, and this has been done actually with second generation and third generation survivors, subsequent research as well, around feeling Holocaust strength. Maybe not directly using that term, but this sense of resilience, this sense of self-efficacy. I can handle it because of my parent or grandparents' experience. And so I think that's a really kind of important piece of the puzzle. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's such an interesting point about thinking of the converse of Holocaust trauma being Holocaust strength. And how can we empower ourselves in whatever life circumstances we may be facing at the moment, with the backdrop of how incredibly strong our survivor grandparents had been in order to even survive and let alone thrive.
Yeah.
Turning now to your work specifically, in your work as a clinician, are there promising holistic treatment paths for intergenerational trauma? Or is the solution to treat behaviors and conditions that result from it individual? For instance, are there non-medical interventions that can help deal with intergenerational trauma, such as community-based solutions?
So I think that's an important question. And with the recent addition to our diagnostic manual of the indirectly witnessing or indirectly experiencing a trauma is now included, and has been since the most recent edition of our diagnostic manual, as a part of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it used to be that if you would only be able to qualify for PTSD if you had directly experienced the traumatic event. And so this change was pretty formative and important and critical in the subsequent research around this idea of intergenerational trauma. How do we treat it? What does it look like in the therapy room? What might we do with it? And so there are trauma-based interventions that could be useful in treating the components of trauma that might emerge from intergenerational trauma, the specific symptoms that might emerge out of that. They've also been doing a lot of research around family resilience, right? Resilient skills. How do we utilize those as an effective way to mitigate the effects of trauma and how trauma manifests within the family unit? Like some of the things we mentioned: communication, cohesiveness, problem solving, being able to regulate emotions within the family unit. So those are also ways that once a family or an individual within a family experiences a traumatic event, that would be another great line of defense. And oftentimes in research, they include, what might be a really good, clinical implication of this study. Oh, we need more interventions that boost family resilience factors, right? And so there are already present family resilience interventions, one particularly out of UCLA that I worked with for several years called FOCUS, Families Overcoming Under Stress. That is an intervention that is evidence-based for use with military and veteran families who have experienced the challenges that come along with being within a military family. And so when we think about interventions that one might use, thinking about family resiliency factors, boosting individual resiliency factors, and some of the more trauma-informed evidence-based treatments that one might use to treat trauma more generally would be a great place to start in terms of non-medical or more behavioral or cognitive interventions for PTSD or trauma or intergenerational trauma itself.
Right. That's really, really important. And I'm wondering along those lines, if there is almost a subfield of psychology that deals directly with Holocaust trauma, and if there are support groups for second and third generation Holocaust survivors.
Well, and I think that's an important question for meaning making, right? If that feels that connectivity, we talked a lot about the importance connectivity, finding support, making meaning, narrative storytelling, all of those things. I think that there definitely are, I hope there are second and third generation support groups. I know that when I was conducting my dissertation, which feels like yesterday and simultaneously decades ago at the same time, there were groups for second generation survivors. And my understanding is that there are third generation survivor support groups as well available. And now with everything being remote and online, they might even be more accessible now in these times, in our times of telehealth, than ever before. And so those are more like formal support groups, but there are ways to initiate connection with survivors of genocide, descendants of survivors of genocide, and promote connectivity in communities through events like this, through webinars like this, where people can come together. I just recently did a talk at a Hillel as well to talk directly about third generation survivorship and being the third generation survivor. And so ways like that are ways that we can create meaning and promote connectivity and connect with individuals who may have experienced similar things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wasserman. This has been so informative. At this time, we're going to open up the session to question and answer. So I'm going to have a look and then we will ask some questions. Okay, the first question from Elaine is, what role does attachment play in second and third generation?
Such an excellent question. And Elaine, we could talk about this for hours and hours, just talking about attachment. And so they have done some research, again, with the parent-child dyadic relationship, mostly with first generation and second generation survivors. And a lot of that research surrounding attachment relates to Daniele's research around the conspiracy of silence. How were survivors able to support their children in meaningful ways if they continued to feel traumatized by their own experience? How were they able to make space for their children's experience? And what we know about attachment, right? How that relates to, that connection, the child being able to turn to parent in times of need for emotional support. And so in thinking about the research that has already been done, there have definitely been shown to be some barriers to secure attachment in those relationships. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was impossible to develop secure attachments, right, between the first and second generation. But in thinking about some of the barriers, right, particularly as we think about the context of right after, and I can speak to my grandparents' experience, they, were married and had my father while they were still in a displaced persons camp in Germany. So again, to think about context, to think about environment, right? And then when my father was 6 months old, coming to, America on the USS Wilson, I believe. And like you mentioned, Lisa, your grandparents' experience of building a life and all of those things, there were obvious ways that resilience was transferred on and that secure attachment was able to be transferred. But I think it's an important question and is very context dependent as well, and speaks to, what was how did the first generation, how did their symptoms manifest? How did their coping manifest? And to even speak to that coping piece, a lot of survivors after the war found these almost like survivor pods where they would get together and speak in Yiddish about their experiences during the war. And when my grandmother died, going through her photos, she had hundreds of photos where she would come together with other survivors. And again, almost like storytelling, meaning making, finding avenues of support, that seemed to be incredibly important and salient for a lot of survivors. I see, Lisa, you nodding as well.
I am, because what you are talking, I share so much in common with what you are expressing. First of all, I would say, just on a personal note, my mother was also born in a displaced persons camp in Munich, Germany. And then subsequently moved to the United States as a very young child. But also talking to your point about almost finding ways to connect with other survivors. I grew up with visiting my grandmother at Roxbury Park. And at Roxbury Park, there was a group of the Yiddische Redendikes who would get together, who would share stories of the old country. They became their own support group as the years went on, and they shared milestones together, building their own community of survivors.
Yeah. I mean, and as we again speak to this idea of meaning making, post-traumatic growth, resilience, social support, and finding avenues of support and connectivity, has often been researched as a very important resilience factor, right? Connectivity, finding support. And for many survivors, not all, but for many, that connectivity, that finding a group of people that understood you to your core, and you were able to share stories and reminisce and connect, seemed to be something that was very important. And so we can learn from that, right? What can we learn from that as second, as third generation, now as fourth generation? Who knows, maybe fifth somewhere, but as we think about subsequent generations, learning from that and taking that as a mechanism of resilience and practicing it for meaning making.
Absolutely. Moving on to our next question from Jennifer. How do you deal with families in which one generation has a stronger identification as a survivor than another generation? How do you deal with the conflict that this can create?
An excellent question. And in speaking to that too, that's why I always like to ask, how salient does this feel to your identity? And knowing that there's not one size fits all, there's not one right answer. So in connecting with that, that's a very important question to ask. How do I connect with? And maybe that's a question for family. How do you connect with, right, as a family member? How do you connect with? How salient does this feel as part of your identity? And to speak to the question around conflict, if there's a stronger maybe connection between one family member and another, knowing that that's okay, right? There's not one right way, there's not a wrong way to sort of connect with parts of our identity. And so to use, some of those communication resilience factors to talk about that conflict, to validate and understand that we all have differences. And if this is a difference in how we identify, right, there's not one right or wrong way to connect with parts of our identity, including this part of our identity as well. And I imagine you're not alone in that. There are likely descendants out there or family members out there that might not find that to be a very salient part of their identity. Or maybe in some instances, it might feel more salient than other instances. And knowing that that's okay. There's not one right or wrong way to connect with parts of our identity.
The next question from Shafira is, Dr. Wasserman, do you see patients?
I do. Thank you for that question. I do. I have my private practice here located in Tarzana, and I do work with patients primarily who have experienced PTSD, trauma, intergenerational trauma, other types of traumas, and that's the bulk of my private practice here in Tarzana.
Great to know. I'm going to make a note of that. Next question from Mark. What for you are the most accurate and illuminating films or books which explore the psychology of post-war Holocaust survival and intergenerational trauma?
Oh, such a good question. I wish I was home. I would take out all of my books for you, Mark, and just send them all to you. And we're actually in the process of moving now, so they're already all boxed up. Maybe I'll just send them your way. I think there's a variety of different books. One particularly by Leon Uris, which is QB7, which is an emotional roller coaster. So oftentimes too, I'm going to put my psychologist hat on for like a quick second. When we read, when we watch films that connect with this experience, being mindful of taking care of ourselves, monitoring how traumatized or re-traumatized we might feel when reading these books, when watching these movies, pausing as necessary, reflecting as necessary, asking for support as necessary is an important point. I would probably say that QB7 by Leon Uris is one of the books that I have read that I recommend. Another one that, again, captures the experience in a quite intense way. This Way to the Gas, ladies and gentlemen, is another one that I have read, and again is intense and emotional. But another one, oh my goodness, There's so many. I would like to simmer on that question mark. It's stumped me a bit in terms of going through my Rolodex of films and books, but I'll maybe ask you, Lisa, are there books, are there films, or maybe even those from the audience that you might recommend?
I definitely agree with you in that Leon Uris has a tremendous power in conveying emotion of Holocaust trauma. And that is a book that I have on my bookshelf as well.
Yeah. Even as you share, like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, I mean, I think it should be a must read for
absolutely
everyone in the universe. Elie Wiesel's Night, those are all ones. Viktor Frankl is one that I've oftentimes recommended for patients, for students. That's one that I think would be an important one. There's also one, a more recent one called The Choice by Dr. Edith Eger. Eger, I might have totally mispronounced her name there for a moment, that I would highly recommend. And she is a psychologist, Holocaust survivor, activist. I would highly recommend checking out all of her books, but The Choice is a more recent one that she's come out with that is beautifully written and captures the experience in a powerful way.
And I would also, to that note, I would add the book Number the Stars, which is a children's book. It's geared for, I would say, middle school age children as a way of an introduction to the history of the Holocaust. The next question is from Mia. As a younger viewer, I know so many who do not even know about the Holocaust. How important do you believe it is to teach this in schools?
I may have a biased perspective, but I think that it's incredibly important to teach this and other genocides in schools. And I think that it's so incredibly important. And I know that there has been a lot of activism and lobbying around how do we teach this in schools, at what age, when, for how long, what books do we utilize, or what teaching methodologies do we want to utilize to teach this in schools. But I think it's incredibly important. The project that Lisa and I engaged in and talked a little bit about, If You Heard What I Heard, is also like an educational project as well around hearing Holocaust stories and recounts from the most recent generation, so from third generation survivors. And so that's another powerful way to communicate stories and narrative in a way, and the intent of that was for it to be powerful. Even the title of the project, If You Heard What I Heard, you would never forget. So another way to utilize videos or documentary recounts to share and educate about the Holocaust.
Right. And to that point, I would also add that there's a direct correlation between education and understanding of other communities, right? Who we may not be a part of, or we may not know members of personally. And when we understand other communities, we have the tools to combat hate. So education is indeed a fundamental tool for our society. Next question from Linda. If Holocaust trauma was experienced as a child, mother was saved by being put on the Kindertransport at age 9 and never saw her parents again, is there a difference in manifestation of trauma in descendants versus Holocaust experienced by a more mature person?
That is an excellent question, Linda. And the research in some ways, and my study didn't, but in many ways, oftentimes this idea of Holocaust trauma is sort of clumped in terms of not identifying the different ways in which a person may have survived. And so I think that's an important variable that needs additional research on, particularly what are the different ways the particular Holocaust experience. And we know that there's an incredible amount of diversity in terms of the survivor's experience. Exactly like you mentioned, Kindertransport, hiding, partisan, concentration camp, work camp. That's not even naming all of them, but there's an incredible amount of diversity in that experience. And I'm not sure that the research currently grasps that level of diversity of experience, but is something that I think needs a little bit more research at this time. So oftentimes in research, when we're talking about Holocaust survivor, we are including all of those experiences. And so we might be missing some of those more nuanced experiences of the survivor, but an excellent question, and one that I think needs a little bit more research on.
Definitely. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So I'm going to move now to a question by Mark. Can you speak to the amount of anxiety and stress that us pass from survivors to their offspring and from second generation to their offspring? And to what extent does this anxiety stress affect functioning in the world emotionally and mentally?
So particularly, studies have shown, and in my particular study, we looked more specifically at the relationship between family communication and psychological symptoms. But there has been research that has been done in second generation survivors around fear, mistrust of others, and anxiety being elevated or higher in descendants of survivors as compared to a control group. And so that anxiety and or mistrust or stress can manifest in different ways and look differently for different individuals. And so in terms of how that anxiety and mistrust can even pass on to future generations, I think that's definitely, into speaking about even in my research, how that showed both in third generation and second generation survivors, that can be something that can be passed on. Now, symptoms, as we even talk about them more broadly, there's been a lot of research more generally done around parental mental health and how that impacts a child's social and emotional adjustment or development. And so there's been a lot of research around how that can even be transgenerational, separate from what we're talking about in terms of intergenerational trauma or Holocaust trauma or things like that. So to what extent, I think it depends and looks different, dependent on severity of symptoms, dependent on are there other caregivers or avenues of support for the child. How is that anxiety and stress communicated within the family context? So I think it can really depend on all of those other variables, including some of the environmental variables that we discussed before, in terms of how that is displayed or how that shows transmission of maybe anxiety or how that shows intergenerational transmission of stress as well. So I think, and I know I'm not wild about this answer, it depends on context, it depends on familial context, it depends on family communication, cohesion, sort of all of those variables that are shown to play an important part in any sense of intergenerational transmission of stress, anxiety, trauma, anything.
Right. And for our last question, I would just build on that concept of familial expression. How do I introduce, this is from Ev, how do I introduce transgenerational concepts of trauma to my parents?
I think that in speaking about, how, that would also depend on context as well, and how things are communicated overall within that relationship. But ways of opening that dialogue, and talking about, maybe even using this webinar as a point of reference. Hey, I attended this webinar the other day and I would love to get your thoughts on this idea. What do you think? Oftentimes a great way to lead with that, gathering a sense of what they think about these concepts, what others think about these constructs in a more inquisitive and curious way. And oftentimes when we come at something with curiosity, it can be a really useful place to come from, right? I'm really wondering, what is your experience of this? Do you feel like this rings true? Does this feel salient? Can often be a good starting point in jumping into conversations like this. Maybe if there is a fear of how is this individual going to take this, I don't want to come at this in a way that would lead them to be defensive or feel maybe sadness or guilt in some way. So coming at it from a place of curiosity and inquisitiveness, right? How do you connect? I'm wondering if this feels salient or true for you. Can oftentimes be a good place to open up that line of dialogue with parents or others as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wasserman. I've gained so much insight and wisdom as a third-generation survivor, and I thank you for providing all of us with your expertise on this subject.
I never will know that how my mother really, when she died.
I've known about the concentration camps as long as I can remember. But I can honestly say I never used to think about it too much.
At first you just hear it, it's just a story, and it's not real. But then one day you realize that, hey, this really happened, and it was really my mother.
Yes. I love them. I love them both.